Perhaps the most significant and infamous period from Anne Boleyn's life is, of course, her execution. When people think of Anne Boleyn, they invariably go straight to the fact that she had her head cut off on her husband's orders. As such, it is natural that Anne's execution is a staple part of any on-screen depiction of the Queen. Be it in film or television, Anne Boleyn's final moments on the scaffold have been portrayed many times. But do any of these depictions actually show the execution in an accurate light? Do any get it completely spot on? And which are way off the mark? Is the actress playing Anne Boleyn wearing the clothes described in the contemporary sources? Does the speech from the scaffold match what we know she said? Is the manner of death even accurately portrayed? As we are in May and just days after the anniversary of Anne's execution, in this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast, I'm going to look back at the many depictions of the most famous moment from Anne Boleyn's life and ascertain whether any actually portray it as it happened on that fateful day, the 19th of May, 1536. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 40, Anne Boleyn's execution on screen, History versus Hollywood. Before I go into the review of the different depictions of Anne's execution, I need to firstly describe what actually happened on the day itself so that we know what we're comparing it against. Now obviously I wasn't alive 500 years ago and was therefore not a witness to the execution. All I can go on is what we are told from the sources that were there. To cover firstly what Anne Boleyn wore, we are told that she wore a dark grey or possibly black gown, a traditional Tudor gown, with a red kirtle underneath. The gown would have been one, as I said, very typical of the time, with long sleeves, a full skirt and bodice. She wore a mantle of ermine fur over the top, and for anyone who is a bit unsure on what a mantle is, think of it a bit like a cape crossed with a poncho, if that makes sense. Some mantles would simply be across the shoulders, whilst other would fall right to the floor. We do not know exactly what type of mantle Anne Boleyn wore, although the mention of ermine fur is appropriate to her rank as queen, given that ermine was a royal fur. The sources also tell us that Anne wore a traditional English gable hood. Now, people often say that Anne only ever wore the more stylish French hood, but this is actually inaccurate if we look at the 1534 Most Happy medal, which is the actually only surviving contemporary portrait of Anne that we know of for certain. She is wearing a gable hood in that, and on the day of her execution she also chose to wear a gable hood, and this was a garment that was very closely associated with English Tudor fashion, and it's therefore my belief and many other historians' belief that Anne very deliberately chose the gable hood on this day. She would die a Queen of England, not a queen wearing something deemed French. As to what actually happened on the morning of the 19th of May, firstly, we are told that shortly before dawn, Anne called on Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, to hear Mass with her. She then swore in his presence, both before and after taking the Eucharist, that she was innocent of all charges. In an age of such fervent religious belief, this is for many irrefutable proof that Anne was telling the truth. Her execution was considered private in that it would not take place on Tower Hill, but within the precincts of the Tower of London itself. She was escorted by William Kingston out into the courtyard of the Tower to a scaffold erected on the north side of the White Tower. For anyone visiting the Tower of London, the space where people queue up to go into where the crown jewels are held is basically the spot where the scaffold once stood. The scaffold had 4 or 5 steps up and was said to have been draped in black cloth, and was accompanied by 4 female attendants, which may have included her young niece, Catherine Carey. It was said that Anne showed no fear and walked towards the scaffold with a devilish spirit. Upon mounting the scaffold, she gave a short speech to the crowd, which, despite being a private execution, still counted around 1,000. Anne gave her speech in a voice that was described as somewhat overcome by weakness, but which gathered strength as she went on. The ermine mantle was removed, and Anne personally lifted off her gable hood to reveal a linen coif in which her long, dark hair had been tied up so as not to impede the executioner's sword. Whether Anne Boleyn was then blindfolded is contested. I think she wasn't, but there are reports that she was, there are reports that she wasn't, so it's a difficult one to say. As Anne was being given the dubious honour of death by sword rather than by axe, there was no block, and Anne was therefore required to kneel upright to await the executioner's strike. She repeated a final prayer several times. "Jesu, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." With that prayer still on her lips, the executioner from Calais swung the sword, decapitating Anne with a single blow before she even had chance to realise what was happening. Anne's head and body were then wrapped in a cloth by her ladies, and she was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where her remains are still held to this day. So that's what happened on the day itself. So on to the review of the different depictions of Anne's execution. The first I will cover is from the 1933 film The Private Life of Henry VIII. The film opens with Anne Boleyn's execution, meaning that Catherine of Aragon's entire story is totally omitted. In fact, somewhat hilariously and awfully at the same time, a card comes up at the start of the film saying that Catherine's story was of no importance, which is just a bit ridiculous, but there you go. Anne Boleyn is played by the golden age of Hollywood legend Merle Oberon. Given that the film was 90 years old, it's, to a modern eye, ludicrously twee. It's very much a product of its time. Spectators of the execution are shown gathering around specially erected stalls, all speaking in the most clipped, upper-class British accents. I mean, they all sound actually like Claire Foy did in the first couple of seasons of The Crown, and I will include a brief clip of that now so that you understand what I'm talking about.
Oh, poor Anne Boleyn. I just feel so sorry for her. Excuse me, madam. Do you mind taking off your hat? We can't see the block. Thank you so much.
Anne walks out to the scaffold wearing a red gown and a French hood. We know that these were the colours because we've got colour stills of what Merle Oberon wore, even though the film itself was in black and white. Upon mounting the scaffold, Anne turns around and says, "What a lovely day," what a lovely day, which I'm sure is the last thing that the real Anne Boleyn would have been thinking. Her speech is omitted, and then there is also the presence of a block. We do not see Anne kneel at the block. Instead, we see the face of Jane Seymour as a cannon is fired to let us know that Anne has been killed. Basically, nothing from this depiction is in line with the records of the day, save the presence of a scaffold and that Anne dies by decapitation. That's really all there is. So yeah, it's not the best. The next is from Anne of 1,000 Days, which is easily my favourite depiction of Queen Anne Boleyn. As the film is basically an Anne Boleyn biopic, it is natural that it ends with her death, and the scene is definitely an improvement on the depiction from The Private Life of Henry VIII, but is still quite far from what the records tell us actually happened. Firstly, Geneviève Bujold's Anne is wearing a long grey cloak, a sort of billowing cloak. The mantle of ermine fur is completely missing, as is the gable hood. She walks towards the scaffold and upon reaching it looks to the left of the scaffold and sees a coffin bearing the king's initials. A look of sad acceptance that she is dying on her husband's orders crosses her face. Once on the scaffold, we see that a very small crowd of just 10 or so people have gathered, including Thomas Cromwell. There were, in fact, as I mentioned a moment ago, around 1,000 people at Anne's execution. We see Anne and Cromwell exchange cold looks of hatred for each other. Her cloak is removed to reveal a black gown, which is almost exactly as described in the accounts, save that it has a white kirtle rather than the red that Anne was said to have worn. Anne Boleyn's speech is also entirely cut, as are her prayers. Instead, she immediately kneels in the straw, and Kingston gives the nod to the executioner to proceed. He waves at a troupe of drummers who immediately begin to drum. And this is actually unique to Anne of 1,000 Days. I've never seen it included anywhere else, the drumming that is. Anne turns and looks at the executioner in the face. In horror, he shouts to his assistant to distract her, which he does. Anne turns her head towards the noise, and as she does so, the executioner strikes. Cannons are fired, and we see the king miles away hearing them go off, letting him know that his second wife is dead. We then cut back to the tower with an aerial shot of the bloody scaffold and Anne's ladies carrying her coffin away. As I said, this depiction of the execution is somewhat better than the private life of Henry VIII, but is still a large way off what actually happened on the day. I could be wrong, but I suspect that the omittance of the scaffold speech was driven by the fact that just minutes earlier in the film, Anne Boleyn has an entirely fictitious showdown with Henry VIII in her cell at the Tower of London, and delivers perhaps the most iconic moment across the whole film, which I will let you hear now, even though it is entirely fictitious.
Before you go, perhaps you should hear one thing. I lied to you. I said I love you, but I lied. I was untrue. Untrue with many.
That is a lie.
It is true. I was unfaithful to you with all of them. With half your court. With soldiers of your guard, with grooms, with stable hands. Look, for the rest of your life, at every man that ever knew me, and wonder if I didn't find him a better man than you. But Elizabeth was yours. Watch her as she grows. She's yours. She's a Tudor. Get yourself a son on that sweet pale girl if you can, and hope that it will live. But Elizabeth shall reign after you. Yes, Elizabeth, child of Anne the whore, and Henry the bloodstained lecher, shall be queen.
A year after the release of Anne of a Thousand Days, the 6-part BBC miniseries The Six Wives of Henry VIII came out. Anne Boleyn dominates the second half of the first episode, which is meant to be about Catherine of Aragon, and is naturally allotted the entire second episode, which focuses solely on her story. Anne is played by the late Dame Dorothy Tootin. One of the things that is most apparent from this series is the clear lack of budget that they were working with. And I think you can actually tell this mostly with the sets, which are quite poorly put together in places. And this is very true of the execution scene. I can't even really tell if it's meant to be outside or inside made to look like outside. It's really weird. Dorothy Tootin wears a sort of white wimple over her head with a red overgown, which is removed to reveal a sage green dress. She mounts the scaffold, gives a speech somewhat akin to what Anne Boleyn said. She's then blindfolded and places her head over a block. Yet again, an inclusion of a block. Just 2 years after this series, the film Henry VIII and His Six Wives was released, once again starring Keith Michelle in the lead role of Henry VIII and Charlotte Rampling playing Anne Boleyn. This film made a really odd move with the execution of Anne Boleyn, namely that it entirely cut it out, which is crazy, given that it is probably the most significant moment of Anne's story. What we see that alerts us to the fact that Anne is dead is Henry VIII talking to Thomas Cromwell. We hear a cannon explode in the distance, and that's our cue that Anne is dead, that Anne's been executed. We literally have nothing more, and as such, there's actually nothing for me to review on that count. The next time that we see Anne's execution played out would not be for another 30 years. In 2003, a 2-part television drama, Henry VIII, was released, starring a very cockney and rough around the edges sounding Ray Winstone, who is in the lead role of the King, and opposite him as his main co-star was Helena Bonham Carter as Anne Boleyn. Although the series told the stories of all of the wives, it was Anne Boleyn who had the most screen time and was also played by the actress who was undoubtedly the most famous of the 6 actresses playing the wives. Alas, Anne's execution is once again lacking in accuracy. Firstly, the execution is depicted as having taken place outside of the Tower's walls, before the baying crowds of London, who accordingly hurl abuse and profanities at Anne Boleyn. Bonham Carter is wearing head-to-toe white satin, with a white linen cap over her hair. The style of her dress is also not remotely Tudor. In fact, it looks much more like what we're told that Marie Antoinette wore to her execution towards the end of the French Revolution. Directly preceding the execution, we also see a scene in which Anne has a last meeting with her daughter, which we know didn't happen, and one of her ladies saying that the king is going to burn in hell for this, which is definitely not something that would have been said. Something this depiction does include is Anne Boleyn's speech, which is almost spot on, save for a few lines that are cut and different phrasings. She is then blindfolded and kneels to await the swing of the sword. It comes down and Anne is killed with one blow. What happens next is unique to this production, in that the executioner proceeds to lift Anne's head, dripping in blood, from the floor to show it to the bloodthirsty crowd. We know this didn't happen. A cannon explodes, and miles away, Henry, riding to meet Jane Seymour, stops, safe in the knowledge that once again he is a free man. 5 years later, in 2008, in the space of just 4 months, Anne Boleyn's death is portrayed twice more. Firstly, in the big Hollywood film version of Philippa Gregory's book The Other Boleyn Girl, and secondly in Showtime's 4-series-long The Tudors. To start with The Other Boleyn Girl, which starred Eric Bana as a very sexy Henry VIII, Natalie Portman as Anne Boleyn, and Scarlett Johansson as Mary Boleyn. The Other Boleyn Girl is highly controversial amongst fans of Anne Boleyn, with good reason. The film depicts Anne as cruel, jealous, and briefly suggests that she did consider incest with her brother, albeit solely as a means of conceiving a child. There is a continued back and forth between Anne and Mary in the king's affections, which spills out into significant sibling rivalry. So yeah, it's not the most accurate of films, and it's based off Philippa Gregory's work, and it certainly did no favours with millions of people who saw it who assume it to be true to life. One thing that the film does get really spot on, though, is the costumes, which were as good as I've seen since the 1972 film Henry VIII and His Six Wives, which really was the gold standard. As such, the costume that Natalie Portman wears at the execution scene is basically faultless, save for a couple of details. The great thing is that firstly, she is wearing what is clearly an ermine mantle. She is wearing a black dress and a traditional English gable hood, and it looks like it's a great interpretation of a gable hood that she wears over a linen coif covering her hair. The only thing that stops it from being a complete slam dunk is the omission of the red kirtle, and also that she's wearing the famous bee necklace from Anne's portraits. As to the manner of the execution itself, it is shown as being inside the tower with a crowd of several hundred people, so comes closer to what actually happened. No abuse or disrespect is thrown Anne's way. So far, so good. Anne climbs the scaffold and delivers a speech which is almost note-perfect to the recorded version. Where the scene stumbles is in the fictitious storyline that Mary Boleyn was in the crowd, having been given word from the king that he will spare Anne's life. When that doesn't come and Mary is instead informed that the execution will proceed, she looks at Anne and gives her the horrified signal that the offer of clemency has been revoked. At this, Anne, overcome with emotion, begins to crack. With shaking hands, she removes the gable hood and her necklace and is pushed down to her knees by the executioner. Her face is contorted with terror as she sobs. She takes a breath and the executioner swings the sword. It was well documented that Anne Boleyn remained highly composed at her execution, and so the sobbing and the sheer terror portrayed by Natalie Portman is inaccurate. We then see an aerial shot of the scene, with Anne's bloody remains prone on the scaffold. The Tudors, starring Jonathan Rhys-Meyers as a, in my opinion, far too lean Henry VIII, and Natalie Dormer as Anne Boleyn, came next. Now, I am notoriously critical of Natalie Dormer's portrayal of Anne. I love her as an actress. I thought she was brilliant as Marjorie Tyrell in Game of Thrones, but I just didn't think she was right for Anne. I thought she overacted a lot. She didn't look right, and she was also not helped by the truly appalling costumes from across the show. Anne's execution scene is, however, one of the things that the show does try and do well. What it certainly excels in is the scenes before the execution, in which Anne suffers delays to her death and the stress that this caused her, all of which we know to be true. To the execution itself, firstly the costume, as to be expected from the Tudors, is all wrong. Anne wears a long fur-lined cloak of crushed red velvet over a pale mauve dress. She walks out to a relatively hostile crowd. The words, "Here she comes, the strumpet," can audibly be heard, and makes her way to the scaffold. Upon mounting it, Natalie Dormer delivers an almost word-perfect recreation of Anne's speech. She is strong, brave, and focused. The show then departs from the facts in that it breaks the speech up somewhat. Anne delivers the bulk of her speech, then pauses to remove her cloak, put the linen cloth over her head, remove her jewellery, pay the executioner, and forgive him for what he must do. She then goes back to her speech, finishes it, and kneels to await the executioner's strike. Accurately, Anne repeatedly prays. As a mark of respect, the crowd gathered to watch her death begin to drop to their knees. A sobbing Sir Thomas Wyatt watches from afar. A somewhat confused Anne then looks about, wondering why the executioner has not struck. The executioner bellows for his sword, and Anne turns her head and looks at the young son of Sir Charles Brandon. This is the first example of the famous ruse that was supposedly pulled by the executioner depicted on screen. Anne stares at the young boy. We see the sword fly in from behind and then have a close-up of Anne's face, clearly in shock as her head falls to the floor. If Natalie Dormer had been wearing a costume that was totally accurate, then I think this would have almost been spot on to the records. Next we have Wolf Hall. Released in 2015, Wolf Hall was a 6-part drama adaptation of the late Hilary Mantel's first 2 books about Thomas Cromwell, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. The series received universal acclaim. In fact, many critics called it perfect television, and I couldn't agree more. I thought Wolf Hall was a masterpiece, and I'm very excited for Season 2, which is just around the corner. Anne Boleyn is played by the incredible Claire Foy, in what is actually my favourite depiction of Anne after Geneviève Bujold, although it isn't a performance for everyone. It's not particularly kind or sympathetic to Anne, but I think those who make that assessment are often looking at Anne through their own eyes, whereas the whole setup of the series, the whole point of Wolf Hall, is that it's ultimately told through Cromwell's eyes. We're seeing Cromwell's Anne, and Claire Foy's depiction of a woman desperately trying to hold on to an increasingly greasy pole feels accurate to what the real Anne Boleyn must have been going through. As to the execution, Anne is dressed in a dark grey gown with a long cape trimmed in ermine fur over the top. There is, however, no visible kirtle, and she's also wearing a very poor version of a French hood, which looks more like a headband. And whilst I'm on this subject, what was with the French hoods on Wolf Hall? On a show that was so accurate in much of its production, why were the French hoods so abysmal? I just don't get it. Thankfully, by looking at the photos from Season 2, they have corrected that. Anyway, I digress. Accurately, Anne is seen handing out alms to the poor as she walks to the scaffold. This did happen, and it's the only version of Anne's execution to include it. Anne is frequently seen looking up, with Cromwell saying that she still thinks there's hope of a reprieve. Anne mounts the scaffold and delivers her speech, which is entirely in line with the records.
Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler, nor more merciful prince was there never. And to me was he ever a good, a gentle, and a sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge best. And thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all. And I heartily desire you all to pray for me. The Lord have mercy on my soul. To God I commend my soul.
As you can hear, she does, however, speak quite softly, necessitating the crowd to walk closer to the scaffold. After finishing her speech, Anne kneels down and is blindfolded. As the band crosses her eyes and the world goes to black, Anne appears terrified and begins to shiver badly. She repeatedly prays and awaits death. As she does so, the executioner reveals his sword to sharp intakes of shock from the crowd. He silently removes his shoes and crosses behind Anne. A piece of Anne's hair flicks up and she attempts to place it back under the linen coif. We as the audience see Cromwell softly saying, "Put your arm down, put your arm down." The executioner quickly moves behind Anne and says aloud in French, "Apporte l'épée." And as Anne speaks perfect French, she knows that this means, "Bring the sword." Her head follows the noise, and in that very moment, the executioner goes back to Anne's other side and swings down, killing her instantly. Anne's ladies, in a rare sign of solidarity, flock around her corpse and tell the men on the scaffold that they do not want any men touching her. Wolf Hall's depiction of Anne's end, like the other Boleyn girl and the Tudors, is almost there but falls short on two accounts. The obvious fear that Anne displays, which as I referenced is also seen in the other Boleyn girl, and the poor costuming as seen in the Tudors. If they got these two things right, then it would have been pretty much as described on the day. The setting is also incredibly bleak. It's really wet and windy, and it looks like the execution is set in October or November rather than in May. And so finally we come to the most recent incarnation of Anne Boleyn's execution, which was from the 3-part drama series on Channel 5 from 2021, simply called Anne Boleyn. This was the controversial drama that caused quite a stir because an actress of colour, Jodie Turner-Smith, was cast in the role of Anne Boleyn. It was entirely expected that the decision to cast a black actress as Anne was going to be met with differing opinions, and that's certainly, unfortunately, what happened. Now, Anne's story is not one about race, so ultimately, you can argue that anyone could play her. But what I actually thought was quite interesting was that several black critics came forward and said that they felt that it was misplaced diversity, and that putting a black woman in a white woman's role isn't genuine diversity, and that true diversity would mean telling the stories of amazing African, Asian or South American queens with as much budget, care and marketing, and that this would have been a much better way of celebrating underrepresented voices, which I think is an entirely fair assessment. In the show, Anne's execution is poorly executed, excuse the pun. As she prepares to meet death, she writes a letter to her daughter Elizabeth, which she then reads aloud as a voiceover. Anne wears a white veil over her face with a black crushed velvet gown and an attempt at a French hood. Upon mounting the scaffold, Anne does not address the crowd. Instead, she walks to her ladies, allows herself to be blindfolded, she kneels, prays, and is killed. We cut to her ladies, broken down with emotion, and that's it, over and done with. So do any of these depictions get Anne's execution completely right? Well, sadly, no, they don't. None of them get it spot on. The closest, ironically, is the film which is the most inaccurate in its telling of Anne's story, The Other Boleyn Girl. It is in this film, as well as the Tudors and Wolf Hall, which almost get there, but have one or two elements which stop them from being spot on. If we took the set and the costumes from The Other Boleyn Girl, with the delivery of Natalie Dormer and what appears to be the time of year, and the accuracy of Anne's death from Wolf Hall, then we'd have had the exact execution as it is recorded. It is only these three, among the many depictions of Anne's final moments, that in any way do justice to the 19th of May 1536, and to the end that Anne Boleyn had to endure. As I referenced earlier, we are on the cusp of the second season of Wolf Hall coming out, and also finally, after 84 years, the release of the film Firebrand about Catherine Parr. As both of these productions do not have Anne Boleyn in them, it isn't clear when we will see another attempt at portraying Anne's downfall. Let's just hope that when the inevitable time comes, that the researchers and showrunners do justice to the thing, and portray Anne as she was on the 19th of May, 1536. Strong, stoic, and spectacular all the way to the end. And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast and my 3-part series focusing on Anne Boleyn's downfall. The first episode, Anne's arrest, and the third, her execution, are exclusive to Patreon or Apple Podcast subscribers. Anne Boleyn's trial, the second in the series in which I spoke to Claire Ridgway, is available to all. To access all Tudor Chest content, sign up at patreon.com/The Tudor Chest. Thank you so much for listening. Reach out to me with any suggestions you've got for podcast episodes, and speak soon.